Nero. That Nero was the Antichrist. And so they don't look at anything forward. And so you wonder why would they adopt this view? Well, if you look back and see where this started, it was back in 1554 by Alcazar, who was a Jesuit priest, and it was in a response to the Reformation. So there was a counter-Reformation that occurred by the Catholic Church, and because people were saying that the Pope was the Antichrist, they wanted to take that away from the Pope and then apply that somewhere else. And so they came up with this view called preterism, made the enemy or the man of sin to be Nero back in AD 70, AD 100. And then there's another view that came from two other Jesuit priests, Lacunza and Rivera. And both of these, we just died, didn't we? It's all right. And both of these were looking at putting everything to the future. So it wasn't the Catholicism or the Pope at the time of Paul or at the time of Jesus that was the Antichrist, but that would all be pushed to the future. So it would be the Antichrist would be someone to be announced. And you can see in futurism, they'll make predictions that it's the Muslims, or it's Donald Trump, or it's Obama. You know, it's just all these different people that now become the Antichrist. Whereas, and we'll look, or later on, we'll look to see what the Antichrist was, or who the Antichrist is, by identifying the little horn. So we have preterism that goes before, futurism that goes afterwards, and then we have historicism that looks at a linear picture of history as it goes through the historical accounts in the past, the present, and also the future. And we're going to look at Daniel 2:27 through 45. Daniel 2, and everyone knows this one pretty well. We just reviewed it just a little bit ago. Just fit into the historicist view. So that's what you're doing over there, Joe. All right.
Say hello.
Reconnect. Daniel, and he forgets the dream, and so then he calls all of his satraps and wizards and magicians and all these people, and he says, hey, I want you to tell me the dream. And so they say, hey, you tell us the dream and we'll give you the interpretation. And he says, no, I don't remember the dream, and I want you to tell me what the dream is and what the interpretation is. And so this was quite a conundrum for all these wizards and satraps, and they didn't know what to do, because if you don't tell me, you're going to die. And so this is where Daniel comes onto the scene, and he goes into the king in verse 28, and he says, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. And so just in the essence of time, we won't read this, but I'll go through it. And the dream was Nebuchadnezzar saw a great statue, if you all remember. And that statue was made up of different metals as you go from the top to the bottom. And what was the head of gold? What did that represent? Okay, so Babylon. And it was a great kingdom. And this was the kingdom that the dream had come to. So Nebuchadnezzar, he was the king. He was that head of gold. And what was the chest? Okay, the chest of silver, and that represented Medo-Persia. And then the abdomen, the belly of bronze, and that represented Greece. And then we had the legs of iron, and what did that represent? Okay, so Rome. And then as we go down through time, and you can see it's a continuum. We're not jumping from one anatomical part to the other. We're going right on down, and then we have the feet of miry clay and iron. And what did that represent? Okay. Yeah, so it was church and state. It was a combination of church and religion, paganism and religion, and that lasted all the way down through time. And then what happened with this great statue? There was a great stone that was not cut with hands, and that stone came and it hit that statue and broke it up into many pieces. And then that formed a great mountain, that symbolizing the end of time and now the time when Jesus would reign, right? That God would come. And so we see it's a continuum from when the prophecy was given to Nebuchadnezzar and then to Daniel. And then it was a progression through time all the way down to the end, right? All the way to the end. And so in Daniel 7 and 8, if we go to Daniel 7, we see the vision of the four beasts. And this is where God gives a little bit more information, or adds to, reinforces this whole historicist view of prophecy. And so we have these beasts that come out of the great sea. And the first was like a lion, and it had wings like an eagle. And this represented, again, Babylon. And then another beast arose like a bear, raised up on one side, which was the Medo-Persians, which means that one was more powerful than the other. The Medes were the older country. The Persians were younger and more powerful. So the Persians, that's what caused it to raise up. And it had 3 ribs in the mouth between its teeth. Anybody remember? And so they conquered those 3 countries. And so they had that in their mouth. And then he looked and he saw a leopard, and it had 4 wings of a bird, and had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And this represents Greece. And what happened after Alexander the Great died? It was divided up into 4 kingdoms. And then there was a 4th beast. It was a dragon-like beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong, huge iron teeth, devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. And I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one coming up from them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and the mouth speaking pomp. Talk a little bit about this little horn power that came up out of the 10 horns. Okay? And so then if we look, we just see again a progression, right? A progression of countries, starting with Babylon, Medo-Persia, then Greece, then Rome, then papal Rome. And then in 7 verse 9, we see the vision of the ancient days. And here it talks about judgment that's taking place. And then, as you can see after that, then the saints then possess the kingdom after the judgment. And so we again see a progression that goes from Babylon all the way to what? Okay, so the judgment or the end of the world. Okay? Actually, it's judgment and then the end of the world. Okay, those two. And then in Daniel 8, what do we see? Daniel 8, we see, again, more detail that is given. This one is written in a sanctuary type motif because it describes the animals now that are all clean animals. And the first one is, what is the first one that represents Babylon? Okay, there isn't one. Babylon, when Daniel received this vision, Babylon had already been destroyed. It had already been reoccupied by the Medes and the Persians. So the first one was the ram that had two horns, and one was higher than the other, and that represents, again, the Persians were more powerful than the Medes. That one was destroyed by the goat with the big horn, and that horn was broken, and there were four horns that came up from that, and that represented the four kingdoms that arose after Alexander the Great died when he was about 30 years of age. And then out of one of those winds, there came a little horn that was exceedingly great towards the south and towards the east and towards the glorious land. And then it makes a description that we'll get into later. But again, this goes to 14, and that's our memory verse text. For 2,300 days, then the sanctuary will be cleansed. So again, we go down to this point, all the way down to the end of judgment when the sanctuary is cleansed. So all three of these prophecies go from the time that the prophecy is given till the time of the end. Is that Sabbath school class singing somewhere else?
No, the major. That's the kids. Kids
Oh.
major.
Oh, how nice.
You got to stay here, Dennis.
I will. I know I want to do that too. So if we look at John 14:29, this is something that Jesus had to say about prophecy. John 14:29. Rick, do you have that one?
Yeah. And now I have told you before it comes to pass, that when it comes to pass, you may believe.
So then, why is prophecy important to us? What did Jesus just say about prophecy? Why is that important? Okay. So it strengthens your faith, for one. And I didn't quite hear what you had to say back there.
So that when it comes to pass, we will know what comes to pass. When it comes to pass, that the Bible gives us written.
Uh-huh.
So not so much necessarily to be able to predict the future and say the next president is the one that brings the Sunday law. It's not so much that as it is to help us as we look back say God has known all along and God is leading, so that we can trust Him, but not necessarily so we will know everything as it's going to happen. That isn't really what God's plan is, I think.
So when we see the end of Daniel 2, what is it that we see? What is that stone cut without hands? What is that? What does that represent?
God's eternal kingdom.
Okay, so it represents the second coming of Jesus Christ, doesn't it? So it's what Jesus is doing at the end of time. He's coming back to redeem us, right? Now, in the second one, in Daniel 7, it ends, and where does this person go to the Ancient of Days to start the process of the judgment? So you see where Jesus is. And then if you tie that into Daniel 8:14, now where's Jesus? What is he doing? What happens to the heavenly sanctuary? It's cleansed, right? And so what does prophecy show us here? It shows us the whole steps of what Jesus is doing, that he's going to come again, and that there will be a judgment. And we'll get more into that in a little bit. Now, the year-day principle. How many of you have wondered about this day-year principle? A day for a year in prophecy. And it's very interesting. If we look at the day-year principle, there are a number of different reasons why this fits. Number one, as you read apocalyptic prophecy, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Revelation 13, what do we notice about all of the different symbols that are in there? Are they literal figures? Do we see leopards with 4 wings? Or lions with 2 wings? Or do we see dragons like what's represented with Rome? We don't see those things, do we? They're symbolic. And so if the figures that we see are symbolic, we can't just assume that the times are going to be literal. And it's very interesting when you look at times, or different times when they're discussed. If you look at Luke 4:25, Luke 4:25, but I tell you truly, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elijah when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months. So how long were the heavens shut up?
3.5 years.
Okay, 3.5 years. All right, and in James 5:17, let's see what it says. James 5:17. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months. And he prayed again, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit. So is this an apocalyptic prophecy that's being given? Do we see any symbolism that occurs in the story of Elijah? And we see directly it says 3 years and a half. If we also look at the language, like in Genesis 6:3, it says 120 years. In Genesis 15:13 through 15, it says 400 years of bondage. And these, again, are literal prophecies that are given. This is how long it's going to last, God says. But they're not apocalyptic prophecies. If we look at apocalyptic prophecies, how is time described? So if I was talking to one of you and I said, okay, well, I'll see you in 42 months. Would that be okay? Or a time's time and half a time. That's when I'm going to have you come over to my house. Times and a half a time. So when we look at this language, we notice that with texts where it's literal, it's a literal time frame. But whereas with apocalyptic prophecies, the time is different. It's given in a different type of format. I'm going to watch. The wind is turning all the pages in my Bible for me.
You didn't have your clothes pinned?
I have them. No, I'm good. I think the Bible's good. Part's good.
There's more in there.
There's a couple more texts I want to look at. Numbers 14:34, if someone has that for me. And Ezekiel 4:6, if someone could look that one up. So Numbers 14:34, Ezekiel 4:6. Looking at this year-day principle. Someone have that? Numbers 14:34. And Ezekiel 4:6. Yep. Okay, so God is talking about a day for a year, right? The 40 years that they went and did their exploration, they came back, they rejected God, and God assigned them a day for a year, right? And so they were in the wilderness for 40 years. And then in Ezekiel 4:6, it's much the same. Ezekiel is asked to build a mini city of Jerusalem, and then he's asked to lay down on his side for how long? Okay, 40 days. And again, he describes a day for a year. Okay, in Genesis 29:27, these are a couple other instances. They're a little more vague, but this is with Jacob and Laban. And was Laban a good guy or a bad guy? He wasn't a good guy to Jacob. And so Jacob wants to marry Rachel, and they have the wedding ceremony, and he goes into his bride, and who is it?
Leah.
It's Leah. And what a surprise. And I guess back in those days they wore masks too. At least the women had to wear masks. So that's what happened. It was Leah, and he was pretty upset. And he went to Laban, and Laban said, "Hey, you can't have the youngest without having first marrying the older one." And so Laban said, "You can have her too. There has to be a waiting period of 7 days." And how long was it actually? So it was 7 days. It was 7 years that he had to serve. So again, a day for a year. And then in Luke 13 is another one. Luke 13.
You hate to equate Laban with God's prophecy.
Yeah. Luke 13. This is fun to try and keep this open. 31 and 32. And here it says, on that very same day, Pharisees came saying to him, "Get out and depart from here, for Herod wants to kill you." And he said to them, "Go tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today, and tomorrow and the third day I shall be perfected. Nevertheless, I must journey today, tomorrow, and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem." So what was Jesus talking about here? Was it actually 3 days that all of that would occur and he would die on the cross? It wasn't, was it? He was talking about in a symbolic nature that this would be years. So it was actually 3.5 years from this time that he was crucified. So in Tuesday's lesson, they talk about identifying the little horn power. And we read a little bit in Daniel 7 about this little horn power. And where did it come from in Daniel 7? Do you remember? It came from the 10 horns, right? 10 horns on the last beast. And it uprooted 3 of those horns, right? And then what did this little horn act like? Was it a submissive and easy to get along with horn? Or was it boisterous, loud, making demands, acting like it's in charge? It fought to change times and laws. It persecuted. So in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, it describes this little horn power is coming out of Rome. Daniel 7, it comes out of the iron beast, out of one of the horns, and then out of the, in Daniel 8, it's described that big horn that's broken into 4 horns, and it comes out of one of the winds. But signifying that it comes out of papal Rome. And these characteristics, it's very interesting. We know that if we look at how long that the Roman power would continue its influence, it was for a time, and half a time. And what does that represent? 3.5 years of apocalyptic time. So 3.5 years, if you do the math, that's 1,260 years. That's how long it says it will occur. And when does this little horn power come into power. It comes in after the Roman, the pagan Roman power, right? After the 10 kingdoms. So when we think about those 10 kingdoms, we know that Constantine divided those 10 kingdoms into the east and the west. And 3 of those were uprooted, and it was about 400 AD, somewhere where they were uprooted. And so this power, this papal power, had to emerge right during that time. And so we know that the 1260 years, we know where they started. They started in 538 AD and went from 1798. So we know that this papal power emerged and ruled and persecuted God's people for 1260 years. And do we see that in history, that actually occurred? I mean, the Pope just a few years ago apologized for all of the persecution that they did, all the way up to 1798. And so we know that this little horn power, according to Daniel 7, Daniel 8, is going to continue all the way, right? That's when this papal power will be destroyed. So when we think of this historicist view, looking at the past, the present, and the future, and when the angel said, close up this book, Daniel, until the time of the end, right, for people to understand, and now after 1844, which was at that time the end of the, we know that we are now in the time of the end. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the investigative judgment, why the investigative judgment is important. But identifying the little horn power, again, it speaks to change times and laws. And what did the little horn power do? If you look at a Catholic Bible, what does it say when you look at the 10 Commandments? Okay, so the second one is gone. And then they split another one in 2 in order to get 10 commandments. So remember the Sabbath day is now the 3rd commandment. And what time did they change in the weekly cycle? God's holy day. They changed Sabbath, the solemnity of Sabbath, to Sunday. And that's been well documented. And Constantine did that in the Edict of Milan. And he venerated the day of the sun as to be the day of worship. So it's very interesting when we see that. Now, the other thing that I thought was interesting in studying about preterism and futurism, where did I say both of these methods of interpretation came from? They came from the Jesuits. Now, Jesuits are part of the Catholic Church. And so if the Bible promotes a historicist view that has continuity, that goes all the way through time, all the way up till the end, and if we have preterism that misidentifies the Antichrist as being either Nero or Antiochus Epiphanes, those things, that really presents a real problem, because what are they actually doing? They are changing times. They are trying to manipulate God's prophecies. And it's the same with futurism. They're saying, no, it can't be, this little horn power can't be the papacy. It has to be something else. So we'll push that off into the future. So this is just another way that the Catholic Church has tried to manipulate prophecy. Can you see that? Another way to manipulate prophecy. I knew I'd have all these all mixed up after the wind blew them away. So we identified the little horn power. And so now we want to look at the investigative judgment. And The investigative judgment, there aren't many other denominations that look at the investigative judgment other than the Adventist Church. And let's look at Matthew 16. Matthew 16:27. Matthew 16:27 and 28. If someone, Rick, can you find that one for me? And I'll get Revelation 22:12 as the second one. Matthew 16:27 and 28.
For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then recompense every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.
Okay, so when is it that people receive their reward? When Christ comes again. So it's based upon their what? Their deeds or their works. And if you look at Revelation 22:12, and it says, "Behold, I am come quickly, and my reward is with me to give everyone according to his works." Now, it's very interesting. What happened in the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve had eaten of the tree of knowledge, good and evil? Did they hide in the bushes?
They were naked.
Yeah. And so who came down to investigate to see what had happened?
Jesus.
Did he ask questions of Adam? Who told you that you were naked? Did you eat of the tree? Did he know that Adam had eaten of the tree? And so he went through this question process, right? So he investigated them first, and then what happened later on? Then he gave them the judgment, right? What's going to happen? But then he also gave them hope. I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. And so we see a pattern of where God comes down and evaluates the situation. What about during the flood? Did God come down and look at the earth and say, wow, this is pretty bad? He did. And then he executed judgment, but there was an initial period of investigation. What about Abel and Cain? Did God come down and talk to Abel and Cain? Or at least to Cain? Yeah. I mean, there was an investigation into what had happened, and then Cain was banished and given the curse. So all through the Bible, if you look, we see that there is always an investigative judgment that occurs. Looking at Daniel 7:9 through 14, and I want to take a closer look, because I think this is very important to remember. In the description in Daniel 7, we're not talking about the second coming of Jesus Christ here. And Daniel 7:9 through 14, and it says, I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued, and it came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The courts were seated, and the books were opened. And in verse 13, and I watched in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man. Who's that? Coming with the clouds of heaven, he came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. And if you look at correlations between the two in Daniel 8:14, unto 2,300 days, and then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. And if we look at that prophecy and we know that the beginning date was 457 BC, right? When the king of the Persians made the edict that the temple should be rebuilt and the walls. And we take that and we look at this prophecy, the 70 weeks, which is 490 years. That takes us to exactly, to the day of when Jesus Christ was inaugurated by John the Baptist in that baptism. To the day. And then it also described at that period when he would be cut off. And it describes his crucifixion to the day. And then in AD 34 when Stephen was stoned, same thing. And that was the time when the Jews no longer were the chosen nation, right? 70 weeks are determined upon thy people. So at the end of those 70 weeks, the Jews had not passed their test. And so when Stephen was stoned, the message of Christ went now to the Gentiles, right? And so we can see that. And if we take that date and then add to it after that 70 weeks, we have the date of 1844, October of 1844. And what happened there? Well, we know. It says in Daniel 7, and it tells us that Jesus came and he went from the holy place to the most holy place to begin the investigative judgment. He says that when his reward will be with him. And how can he determine a reward without first having an investigative judgment? To look at the books and see what's going to happen. And in Daniel 7, that's exactly what is described. Well, we don't have much more time, and I want to talk a little bit about the typology, because I thought that was very interesting. But did you all get that? This is not talking about the second coming of Christ, but it's talking about October 22, 1844, as being a pivotal date when Jesus moved from the holy place to the most holy place. His ministry as our high priest came into play. So what about typology as prophecy? What does typology mean? A type.
Something serves as a symbol for something bigger.
Okay. And you guys went through the ones that they gave in the lesson study. Matthew 12:40. Jonah was 3 days in the belly of the whale, and Christ was 3 days in the earth. So we have an Old Testament story that now describes what Christ is looking at. So Christ used typology. And just a few examples that I wanted to give in Genesis 22, looking at types. Genesis 22, this is the story of Abraham and Isaac. And if Sarah had only knew, what Isaac was going to do, or what Abraham was going to do with Isaac. And so they climb up Mount Moriah, and Abraham is going up there to make a sacrifice. And does he take a ram with him to go? What does he take? His son, some kindling.
A knife.
Yeah, and a knife. And so they get up to Mount Moriah, and he provides the sacrifice. And what does Isaac say?
Where's the offering?
Exactly. Where is the offering? And then in 22 verse 8, Abraham answers and says, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So the two of them went together. And so he places his son on the altar. Then the angel stops him. And then he looks in the thicket. And what's in the thicket? Okay, so the sacrifice is in the thicket. And what is it stuck in? What's a thicket?
Briar. Thorn.
Okay, so it's thorns. And so the sacrifice that God provides, he's talking here about Jesus. And what about Jesus? Did he have thorns on his head? So is this story a type of Christ, where a loving father gives up his son, his only son? And it describes in detail what that sacrifice is going to be like. In Genesis 37 through 50, we see Joseph. Now, how is Joseph a type of Christ? As we look to see what happened. Was Joseph rejected by his own people? Did his own people want to kill him?
Sold.
Yeah. So, I mean, they wanted to kill him. So he was lucky, he was fortunate, God's providence. He was sold to the Ishmaelites and then sold into slavery in Egypt. And then what happened in Egypt? What happened to Joseph? Was he falsely accused of things? Was Jesus falsely accused of things?
He was in prison for 3 years.
Yeah.
Maybe 3.5.
And so and then what happened to Joseph in the end? He became the right-hand side of the greatest ruler in the world, right? Second only to Pharaoh. And what about Jesus? What happened with him? We just read about it in Daniel 7. He went to the right-hand side of the Father, and it was given to him all dominion and power, right? And so we look at types like this. What about Moses? What about Moses? What about the brazen serpent in the story of Moses? So I always wondered about that story when that brazen serpent was placed when all the snakes came and they were attacking all the children of Israel. And if you looked up at the bronze serpent, that you would be healed of the snake bite. And then later on, Christ says, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto me, referring to this episode. And so here we see type meets antitype. And then we also see Moses when the children of Israel were dancing around the golden calf. And what did God want to do? He wanted to destroy them, right? I'll take you, Moses, and I'll make you a great nation. But these people are hard-headed. And what did Moses do? He pleaded and interceded. And so it's again a type of Christ in the ministry that Christ has. Not that God is a vengeful God, but that is his position as our high priest. And then when we think of type meeting antitype again, what about all of these ceremonial services that occurred? The Passover, the wave sheaf, the festival of booths, all these different ceremonial things that were done in the sanctuary service. What did those point to? They pointed to Jesus, didn't they? Each and every one of them. And so when Christ died on the cross, and the Bible says type meant antitype, and the curtain between the holy place and the most holy place was torn, and the lamb escaped from the priest, that was a sign that these ceremonial laws were no longer necessary because Christ had fulfilled all of those things.
Wonder what those priests thought.
Yeah, because I understand that was a pretty thick. It wasn't like a silk curtain. It was pretty thick, and it was torn from top to bottom. So, and I imagine it was pretty high. It was a pretty big curtain. the whole sanctuary service shows us, as a person came in to ask for forgiveness of their sins in the outer court, they would come to the altar of sacrifice, and they would slay the lamb. And then the blood would go to the different portions of the sacrificial service. And it shows us that in that outer court where he was slain, and then the ministry that Jesus had in the holy place, and then finally in the most holy place. And then finally we have the Day of Atonement, where all of those sins are now placed upon the head of the goat that goes out into the wilderness, and that signifies the type, an antitype of Satan as that goat. And what happens? That Satan will be responsible for all of the sins that were cleansed from the sanctuary. And it's amazing to see how all of that works with type and antitype. So what does this mean to us that, again, this need to understand prophecy, to understand that it's a historicist view, to understand that the Pope is the Antichrist? Why is that important? How would it throw us off if we have it a different way? If you look at Christendom today, most people believe in futurism. Futurism. That means that everything's pushed off sometime past Revelation 4. And they believe in dispensationalism instead of a covenant theology. And that's important because if you believe in dispensationalism, you believe that Jesus is coming in a different way. That you believe in the secret rapture, that Christ will come as a thief in the night, and that people will be rescued from the persecutions that will happen. And what does the Bible say about that? Does it say that God's people will be taken up to heaven before the persecution? No. Psalms 23, what does it say? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Because thou art with me and comfort me. Thy rod and thy staff shall comfort me. And so we see that through all of these things, was Noah taken to heaven during the flood? Or did he have to go through that and was preserved by the power and the grace of God? It was. So it's important for us to see that God is a uniform God. He gives us the history that we need to make decisions, to bolster our faith, and makes it so we want to share that information with other people. And so the historicist view is very important for us to recognize. What if we don't believe in the investigative judgment? How does that work? Why is that important? Is it important for us to know that Jesus is in the most holy place, getting ready for that Day of Atonement? It really does, because Hebrews says that he is our high priest, and he is the one that saves us. What if he is still in the holy place? What if we leave him in the holy place? That means there's no Day of Atonement. That means there's no forgiveness of sin. And so it's important for us to know where Jesus is in the time frame of the judgment and the second coming. So I think our time is just about up, so let's go ahead and close with prayer. Any other comments anyone has about prophecy and historicism? Father in heaven, we're thankful for your word. We're thankful for the way that you present it to us in this historicist method, that we may know the truth. You are a God of order, not of chaos. And what you've done with your word is a very simple yet profound presentation of Jesus. We thank you for that, we pray. Amen.